Welcome to Spirit Outspoken, the podcast for Christians who are ready to explore the deeper side of faith. We believe God's truth is bigger than what we've been taught, and that real spirituality isn't something to fear, it's something to discover. Each week, we open the space to explore miracles, energy, healing, consciousness, and divine science, all through the lens of a God who loves us and a faith that's still unfolding. Whether you're deconstructing, rebuilding, or just feeling spiritually stuck, this is your place to reconnect with wonder, deepen your walk, and let the Spirit speak. In this episode, we sit down with the incredible Bob Vetter, a cultural anthropologist, healer, and spiritual mentor with over 25 years of experience. Bob has dedicated his life to preserving traditional wisdom while helping modern healers thrive in their purpose. His work beautifully blends ancient ceremonial traditions with modern insight, creating a grounded, nourishing path for those who support others. We were so moved by Bob's beautiful energy and presence, and we know you'll feel the same way.
So my background, my academic training is as a cultural anthropologist, and I started out interested in spirituality, and it was largely because I felt like there was something wrong in my own society and I was looking somewhere else. So from the time that I was a child, I felt like the standard answers that I got didn't really fulfill me. So I was looking at cultures all around the world. And trust me, when I was a child, yoga, meditation, Eastern philosophies, all of that, none of that was something that people were much into, or if you were, it was kind of a fringe thing. So those were my interests, and eventually when I went to college, it's what led me to anthropology, where I could study academically and I could look at how different cultures approach the notion of spirituality and answering the big questions of life. Who am I? Why am I here? What should my life be all about? Where did I come from? All of these questions. So as an undergrad, I was interested in philosophy and anthropology. And then when I went to graduate school, it turned out that I ended up, through a curious twist of fate, I ended up doing my field work looking at the intersection of healing and spirituality by interviewing Native Americans. And eventually I met an old man named Oliver Patapony, who was the last medicine man of the Comanche tribe. And he adopted me as a grandson. And when I say that he adopted me, it wasn't in the conventional sense of the word. My parents were still alive at that time, and I had my family. But among Native Americans, particularly in that area, this idea of what anthropologists call fictive kinship is very common, where they will extend kin relations to somebody who is not related by blood. So he took me into his family, shared with me his story of healing and transformation that ultimately really came to put me in the direction of being a healer for the remainder of my life. So, we can or might not get into that story, but it's an amazing story about his healing from terminal cancer. Eventually, I met members of lots of different tribes of Native Americans, because in Oklahoma, there are 39 federally recognized tribes. So I eventually created a program. After I graduated from graduate school, I created a program where I brought people in to Indian country, and they got to spend time with people from lots and lots of different tribes. And in the course of doing that, I extended my relations and eventually was adopted into a Kiowa family, a Cheyenne family, Caddo family. And all of this was profound healing for me, because I guess you could say that I grew up in a dysfunctional, broken family. I was an only child, and my mother and father divorced when I was a baby. I was raised by my grandmother, who was working a lot of the time. So I was, sort of left on my own. So I didn't have any family around me other than my grandmother. This time that I got to spend among Native Americans, not only was I delving into spirituality, but I came to see spirituality embedded in social relations. And that was very healing for me in what had been this road, my road in life. Eventually led me to healing practices, not just there, but I came to study curanderismo, which is a traditional healing practice in Mesoamerica. So travels taking me to Mexico, to South Texas, to New Mexico, lots of different places to learn from different healers there, different healers in the United States, in different systems of healing, and then eventually to create this program that I share called Soul Medicine, where we learn to heal ourselves and heal others. But that's another whole story. I'm getting ahead of myself. But that's a very, very quick trajectory of my life, of what brought me to the advanced age that I'm at right now.
Could fill like 10 podcast episodes with just your story. Just because of my own personal fascination with healing, physical healing, healing of ailments. I know I shared that when we first met that my second oldest son was diagnosed with leukemia shortly after his fifth birthday. And I've always been a really spiritual, faith-filled person. Um, Grew up Christian, still am Christian. But a lot of my understanding of how energy works and healing works, and really using Jesus's principles of healing, but also expanding my own thought based on my own personal experiences with my son. I'm just like fascinated with this topic. Can you share a little bit more about what you learned about healing, about terminal cancer from that gentleman who took you in and adopted you, so to speak?
Yeah. So, first of all, you mentioned that you're Christian, and I'm guessing a
Yeah.
lot of your listeners are too. And what I should mention is that in my travels in Indian country, I found a spectrum of religious belief. At the one end of the spectrum, people who only practice their own indigenous spirituality. And then completely at the other end of the spectrum are Native Americans who only practice Christianity and actually condemn their own tribal beliefs.
Interesting.
But most of them that I know in Oklahoma fall in right in the middle. They
Mhm.
believe both in Christianity, or more accurately, let's say the path of Jesus. I think that would be a better way to describe it than the
It's
religion.
a very important clarification because I think, for what it's worth, I mean, that's more so I think who our listeners are, is not necessarily like what you would deem mainstream Christianity today. We often say like the loudest Christian voice in the room currently.
Yeah.
It's more about like the understanding of the real Jesus. So yes,
So
we're tracking.
yeah, so people who follow the path of Jesus and combine the two, or don't see any contradiction in them at all. So my Comanche grandpa, we called him Grandpa Chief. He wasn't technically a chief, but people in the tribe gave him that honorific title. So in the family, we just referred to him as Grandpa Chief. And Grandpa Chief told me, I asked him one time, I said, how can you be Christian and at the same time practice your traditional religion of your people? And he said, there's no conflict at all, because we're in all those cases, we're worshiping the same man up above. That's how he described our creator, the man up above. So this story, like I said, really came to shape my life. And here's what he told me. He said, I never set out to be a doctor. He referred to himself as a doctor. He said, I never set out to be a doctor, but I got sick. And I went into the hospital in Lawton. That's the name of the city in Oklahoma nearby. And he said, and I was there, and the doctors diagnosed me, and they said that I had cancer and that it was terminal. And at one point, the lead doctor sat down with me and he said, we doctors, we had a series of meetings about your case, and we've decided that we've done everything for you that we can do. Now, we can ease your pain if you want to stay in the hospital, or we can send you home, but there's nothing else that we can do for you. And he said, well, I'll go home. He said, maybe I can try to take care of this the way that our old folks used to. So his wife and his son came in, and he said to them, he said, take me out there to the hills and leave me out there. There might be something out there that can help me. And his wife said, you're not man enough to take it. They're going to run you off. Now, let me explain what that means. They believe that there are these certain energies or entities or spirits, however you want to look at it, that inhabit these places on the earth. And that if you go on this vision quest, that's what we call it. That's not his term. He just called it going up there on the hill. You go with no food, no water, no companionship, no shelter for a span of time that you decide on before you're going to go. But if you go there with this intent and you leave for whatever reason, very often it's fear. But if you get scared and you leave, whatever the intention was that you set, it's never going to come. Whatever it is that you wanted will never come to you. So she said, "You're not man enough to take it. They're going to run you off, meaning they'll scare you when you'll leave." And he said, "Well, the doctors gave up on me. I've got nothing to lose." So his son took him to this place in the Wichita Mountains in southwest Oklahoma. They're an amazing place. That they're not particularly high, but they're very rocky and craggy, and they're I think the oldest mountains in the United States. It's just what's left of them now. And his son left him at a certain place that he knew as a place of power. He left him there with nothing but a sheet to cover himself up, an eagle feather to hold on to, 4 corn shucks or corn husks, and some tobacco. And he went to that spot and he sat down and he waited and he held the eagle feather in his hand and he smoked the 4, they're called prayer smokes. So you roll them out of this corn husk and you smoke it. And their belief is that the power of tobacco is not the way we think of tobacco as an indulgence, but they believe that your prayers go to the creator through that smoke. So you puff on it while you're praying and the smoke carries the prayers upwards. So he said, "I was there, nothing happened, nothing happened, nothing happened." He was there on the night of a new moon, so it was pitch black. And he said, toward morning, I could see something off in the distance. It looked like a flickering of a distant flame. And it seemed to be getting closer and closer. And it would light up and then it would go out. And then it would light up and it would go out. And he said that after a while, he could sort of make out a form, like a human form. And it got closer and closer, and he could realize that it was this form. And every time it exhaled, fire shot out of its mouth. And he referred to this as the visitor. And he said, "I got scared when I saw that visitor coming towards me." And he this was his way of describing it. He said, "I was like when you take a fish and you put it on dry land, the fish flops around helpless." And he said, "I was that way." And he said, finally, this visitor got up in front of me and shot me with the fire, with an exhalation, shot me with the fire. And he said, that was it. When I got hit by that fire, everything stopped. I couldn't move. My breathing stopped. My heart stopped until finally the visitor started to speak to me in my Comanche language. And the visitor said, "What are you doing here?" And Grandpa Chief said, "I'm sick." And the visitor said, "There's nothing the matter with you." He said, "But they sent me to take care of a man who's real bad off." And then he started to take off to the west. But then he turned around before he left and he said to Grandpa Chief, he said, "Son, did you know that this whole world that we live in stops for just a very little while, for a moment right before the sun comes up? And that's the time when things like me can enter into this world." And with that, the visitor took off. And he never saw the visitor again. But he also never went back to the hospital or the doctors again because somehow he was healed of that cancer. Then, a little time after that, he was walking down the road in this little town. He lived way out in the country, but the closest little town was called Apache, Oklahoma. And he was walking down the street, and a Comanche medicine woman saw him. And she came up to him and she said, "What happened to you?" And he said, "Nothing." He didn't want to talk about it. And she said, No. I can tell just from looking at you that something has changed. What happened to you?" And he finally reluctantly told her the whole story. And she said, "Well, you're good for something. And right now you might not know what that is, but sometime soon you're going to find out exactly what it is, and you're going to find out how useful you are to other people." So the word started to get out that what had happened to him. And then people started to show up at his house with various types of sickness and illness. And he started to think back. Now, he was born, we don't even know exactly when he was born because they didn't keep birth and death records at that time in what was called Indian country. It wasn't even the state of Oklahoma yet. But he was probably born maybe around 1898, something like that. So he remembered back to the ways that he saw these old timers doctoring when he was a little boy. So now, if you could imagine the imprint that made on his mind when he was that age, but those old men who were medicine men, they were around from like maybe 1800, so we're going way back when we talk about this. But he remembered it, made an impression on him. And he eventually realized that he was destined to be what's called a coal doctor. And his type of doctoring was to take a live red hot coal out of a fire and put it in his mouth. And the way that he explained it to me, he said that sickness is like a fire and you've got to fight fire with fire. So he used the heat from the coal to activate this power inside of him. And the way that he explained it was that the patient would then become like movable in my hands. And he said it's kind of like when you pour cement. When you first pour that cement,
Yeah.
you can shape it to whatever shape that you want, but then after a while it settles. And that's what he said, that's what I do. I shape the person's flesh to the way that it should be so that it stays that way. And that was how he explained his doctoring to me.
It's just so beautiful.
I know. And I think a lot about how I love the perspective of like we're all serving the same God, right? And to leave interpretation and leaving our own instincts of like how we know how to heal. You know, however we've learned that from, we can all kind of tie it back, right? Like laying hands on the sick or, you know, your belief has made you whole. Like I think about the story that you just said and it's all the same. It's all the same, even though like the way that perhaps as a Christian, we've been raised to think like this is what it needs to look like. When you listen to this beautiful story, it's actually things that we've heard in other places, right? Not just Indigenous culture. And I think like that is what's so cool. And that, you know, he took his own pain and his own sickness and his own journey to then go heal other people.
And he thought it was the doing the work that God intended for him. You know,
Sounds like it was.
Yeah.
and you know, let's face it, Jesus was the ultimate medicine man.
Yes, that's
So,
right.
so another story, another quick story is, you know, many years later, another old man adopted me as a nephew. He had wanted to adopt me as a son, but another man from another tribe had already made me his son's nephew was the closest that we could get to that. So he adopted me as a nephew and he asked me to write the book of his family, which is the book that I think I told you about. Big Bow, The Spiritual Life and Teachings of a Kiowa Family. And Uncle Richie told me was that this is doing the work that God intends us to do. And he told this story. He had been a medicine man for most of his life. And at one point, he went in for surgery to have his heart operated on. And he was laying unconscious on the operating table. And the doctors had his heart out of his chest. And they were doing this surgical procedure. And in the middle of it, he sat up on the operating table, waving his hands up in the air and speaking. And they were shocked by this because, you know, he was deep under anesthesia. So he came out from under it, and the attending nurse, waited until he was out of the anesthesia, and she came in and she said, Mr. Tarta, I need to ask you a question, you know, because I've been a nurse my whole life and I saw something today that I've never seen in my life before. And she described it, you know, that he didn't even know what happened, but she described about how he had sat up on the operating table, shaking his hands in the middle of this surgery with his heart literally out of his body. And she said, can you tell me who you were speaking to? And he said, oh, yeah. He said, I was talking to God and God was speaking to me. And he said, God gave me a passage in the Bible to read. And he went back to that reference, and that was part of what guided him in his life, because he was as strong a Christian as I've ever met, and felt that there was no conflict at all between these healing ways of his people and the way of Jesus.
What was the passage?
Yeah.
Do you remember?
Wow, you know, it's I can get it for you. I
Okay.
give it to you when we're done with the podcast. I'll give you the passage and you could share it separately, because I don't want to walk away and get it right now, but I can.
Yeah. No. Please. No, that was so beautiful. Gosh.
One thing that we're really trying to do with our platform is connect some of the dots for people and really allowing people the freedom to explore and learn and see the beauty and the value in all these different religions and practices. Because very similarly, Jason and I both have this sense of like everything's connected and it all leads to the same guy in the sky as you were talking about. So I just think that's beautiful, because to me, that feels so beautiful that we're all connected and there's wisdom and it's all flowing together in just this really beautiful way. I love
I
that.
agree. I agree.
Yeah.
People are either lumpers or splitters. That's one way to describe it. So if you're a splitter, you like to define very carefully a cultural trait, whatever it is. And if you're a lumper, you say, we're all basically the same. And I like to say that I think we need a little bit of both of those perspectives. I think it's important to honor our cultural differences, to discover what they are, and then find the commonality. Then find out, how are we the same? How are things clothed in the cultural traits of the culture that I grew up in? And that's why I love, for example, Joseph Campbell's work when he wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he said, we're all on a hero's journey, and it's expressed in this thousand different ways. And I think that's such a beautiful way to look at it.
I think it
Absolutely.
is too. And what Rachel's saying is so accurate, right? Like trying to expand our understanding, trying to expand our viewpoint, right? And then pulling in and understanding that there are differences. And that is what's beautiful, right? Like we are all
Mhm.
the same, as in we are all from the same source. And I think when that is the underlying thing, then these differences become really beautiful. And, where I think, for me personally, where I get a ton of fulfillment learning about other spirituality is because a lot of things that I've known to be true intrinsically, I sometimes find from other cultures or from other belief systems that aren't just necessarily quote unquote Christian, right? They may reinforce the teaching of Jesus than Christianity itself does, right? And I think that's really what's so cool is that you kind of distill down all of the dogma. And there's going to be dogma in every kind of religion. You're saying that there are some tribes that are like, I am all the way fully Christian, where I now condemn the practices that are from my ancestors, and then all the way to the other side, right, where there's still finger pointing. It's that beautiful place in the middle where we're saying, okay, I'm open to learning, and just in doing so, it's like that's where the commonalities just seem to come out on their own, right? I don't know. I just
Absolutely.
think it's so cool.
Yeah, and I can give you another example. So a Cheyenne elder and spiritual leader, his name was Moses Starr. He adopted me as a son, and his funeral was the perfect example of this. So the first part of his funeral was in a church, and the line was out the door and down the road of people trying to get in, to the church service. But then we went to the grave site, and at the grave site there were the chiefs lined up, and they were singing the spiritual songs that would send him off on his journey. That's, as far as I'm concerned, that's a beautiful thing. It's a
Yes.
beautiful thing that
Absolutely.
it was each aspect of that he was in his life. That he followed the teachings of Jesus and the way of his people, and they were both represented in that funeral that would send him off to the afterlife.
Yeah. I love that. Instinctively, that just feels so loving and beautiful to me. Like when we can embrace and incorporate and include, and that diversity itself is just so amazing to hold
And
space for all
and
of
it
it.
also connects with what I told you earlier when I told you about this adoption ceremony. What is that? That is extending a family relation to somebody that you're not related to. And in the same way that Christianity, or the teachings of Jesus, took a religion that was a tribal religion of ancient Judaism and said, now we're going to be a universal brotherhood. Now you don't have to belong to a particular culture or background. And these teachings and these ways will apply to everyone and anyone who chooses to go that way.
I hadn't thought about that. That is like what it was supposed to be. And
Mhm.
I think like perhaps that's how it started. And it's not so much that anymore, right? It's like you belong, you don't.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. But I
Yeah.
mean, I really hadn't thought about that being like an initial tribal belief system that models a lot of what we know in modern day now, like looking at indigenous culture or others, because like that's what's most recent in our history, right? But if you go back 2000 years, that was really the genesis of what Christianity was intended to be, I think.
It was supposed to be for everyone. And, clearly, if you look at Jesus and what he taught and what his actions were, he wasn't about dividing people into denominations.
Mhm.
There was no such thing as a Catholic or a Protestant. There wasn't a Baptist and a Methodist. It was him coming to the people and doing what? Sharing teachings with them, using stories as metaphors, and healing the sick.
I know.
And that's
Yeah.
the life of a traditional healer.
I
Yeah.
know. I know. I think about that often. Like we've over pivoted to like rules and regulations and you're in or you're out. And like personally, I grew up with a really strong message of Jesus's healing promises. I feel very thankful for that, because I feel like that was instilled in me at a very young age. And I found that, faith very useful when my son was diagnosed. And I'm realizing now that was so immersive for me personally. But when you zoom out, that's really not the lens in which people view Jesus. They don't view him as a healer. I think we've gotten kind of so far away from who he really was. One thing I want to say, and then Rach, I think this would be great if you could lead us into some shadow work
Yeah.
conversation. But, I think it's really interesting about how people think now that you fit in or out of Christianity. It's all or nothing. I was just talking to Rachel this morning. I posted something on social media that was like, you don't have to be Christian to learn about Jesus. And people went bananas. They were like, do you even know what Christian means? And it can't be, it has to be all or nothing. And I was like, man, that's so disappointing because somebody who's searching for something, searching for healing, searching for something to model for love and compassion because they look around and they're like, this ain't it, to then point the finger and say, no, 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 there's only one right way to follow Jesus, to me is just heartbreaking because you are speaking about people from a completely different culture that have blended it so beautifully and have stories of real healing and healing other people. Like, I'm sorry, but like the quote unquote enemy isn't going around healing people.
Right.
Okay. Like,
Yeah.
like let's just distill it down.
Well, if I can take what we're talking about here and use that as an introduction to this theme of the shadow, I think we can make sense of it. That there's a light side and a dark side to everything. And if we look at Jesus' original message, that's the light. Now, I'm gonna step on some toes here. So I apologize. Well, I
Yeah.
apologize in advance if there's anybody listening who I offend, because I really don't mean to. But to my way of looking at it, if your religion divides you from humanity, that's the shadow side of organized religion. If Jesus' message was to bring people together in a universal message, in a universal way that brings us closer to God, then what condemns other people and what divides us is the shadow side of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were just talking about recently, how like in the Bible, it talks about following the fruit, right? And the fruit of the spirit. And if something is aligned with God, it will produce peace and love and, all these beautiful things. And it's such a distinction of purity versus the shadow side, exactly like you're talking about. Yeah.
So, how would you like to start our conversation about shadow?
Like how do you work with the shadow side? Like how I think like I mean I just don't know about it, and I think that that's something that I've really started to go down. And I feel like Rachel, you have done more of this work than I have personally. So I think there's a lot of listeners that like don't even know. I think they have an idea of what shadow work is, but like how does it work? Like how do we heal through shadow work, right? Like that kind of stuff. I think that would be really helpful. What else do you think would be helpful, Rach?
Yeah. And I love your message too of how, because I see it so often repeated out, is this idea of like we heal ourselves and then we become a healer for others. That over and over. People who have struggled with something. I mean, Jason, you're going through this right now. Your son went through cancer. Now I have this desire to help other people going through that. And that even our shadow and this really hard stuff we go through can be turned into this really beautiful thing that we're able to put out into the world and use for good. So I love that whole message of like healing and then paying it forward, so to speak.
So, let me address that. So, the first thing that we have to do, particularly if we're in a context of Christianity, is to say that there is a big distinction when we talk about light and shadow, we are not talking about good and evil. So they're not the same at all. And Carl Jung was probably the modern or relatively modern figure who was best known for incorporating shadow work into his work within the field of psychology, but a very spiritualized form of psychology. And the notion of the shadow is to say that the shadow is where everything is placed that doesn't belong in the collective notion of the way that I'm supposed to be in the world. I bury the stuff that I don't want to deal with into my shadow. So the shadow is this aspect of self that I try to hide from the world, and that I somehow am under the mistaken impression that nobody sees it. I want to keep it hidden, and I don't want anybody to see it. I know about it, through some inner rumbling, but I'm doing a great job of hiding it. Meanwhile, everybody around me knows it. So that's the stark reality of the shadow. The way that we work with the shadow, though, is to talk about our values, about the things that are important to us, and then think, well, if I say that I want this, what's the shadow side of that? It's a process of inquiry. So, I gave you the description about how I think of denominational Christianity as the shadow side of this loving path of Jesus, this incredible figure who was divine. So what I would say is to you and to anybody who's listening, well, what is it? What are your professed values? What are the things that you say that you want your life to be? And then is there an aspect of your life that you hide because maybe it doesn't live up to that? Is there a way that it's expressed in the things that I say or that I don't say, the things that I harbor, the things that I do when nobody is looking? That's always the shadow. And what we're attempting to do actually is to befriend the shadow rather than thinking of the shadow as an enemy, to think of the shadow as an opportunity to bring light to what was lying in darkness. And that's the purpose of it. That's what shadow work is all about. It's this process of inner inquiry.
I am tracking and I'm so into this. Like, I don't know why, but this like makes me sort of want to cry. But can you I know, I feel like you're talking to my soul right now.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of maybe somebody who's worked through some shadow work? Because I think like sometimes I loved your explanation. Like we have these ideal values and then we somehow have this shame or guilt because we're not maybe living or thinking in a way that aligns with what we really see ourselves as or what we want to be. Can you
Yeah,
maybe
so
give an
let me
example of like how that plays out?
Sure. Let me give you an example of a client of mine
Yeah.
who she has lived her entire life in the shadow. And her constant inner dialogue has been, you're not good enough. You should be ashamed of yourself. Whatever you want to do, you shouldn't be doing it. You're dirty. You're bad. I mean, on and on and on and on. And the light that she has hidden because of the shadow is the opposite. And we just kind of co-discovered that what has happened is that the loud voice for her is the shadow, and the soft voice is this beautiful understanding of who she is. And the problem is that she gave herself over to only listening to the loud voice. And she's about 70 years old, and she's afraid about dying and wants to make sure that her life is meaningful and means something. And so we're moving to understand how the light of it is this connection with other people. Her path early in life was as a type of healer, a type of therapy. I don't want to go into too many specifics of the story, but she gave that up at one point and felt like she shouldn't be doing that anymore. And yet here she is now discovering this incredible power that connects her with something sacred and at the same time with all of humanity. So the shadow was the flip side of it. The light side is her connection with spirit, her connection with humanity. The dark side of it is the flip side of that, the isolation, the thought that she's not good enough, the thought that she doesn't deserve to have the kind of relations relationships that other people have. And I give that example because it's kind of a dramatic one. It's not always quite that big of a contrast between the two, but in this case it is. Does that make it clearer?
Yeah, absolutely. So is like the goal to uncover the shadow work is to not fear it or to not ignore it, right? But like acknowledging it, bringing it to light, and then incorporating that as a teacher almost.
Exactly. Thank you. Not I hate you, go away, but
Yeah.
thank you for what you've taught me. Thank you for what you've brought me to at this moment in my life. I mean, it's a beautiful way of looking at it, isn't it?
It is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's so ironic. So just today, I don't want to get us off course, but I mean, this connects with everything we were talking about today, Jace. So I am really struggling as we're putting ourselves out there. I want to make sure that the energy I'm bringing is pure. And one of my values is peace. And just today, we were talking about that's a great value. But if it's peace at all costs, it costs me authenticity, which is another one of my values, right? Like to not say something because it might offend someone.
Yeah.
It's like balancing these things.
Sure. Sure. And I mean, peace, when you want to look at the shadow side of it, I don't know you, Rachel, so this is not accusatory in any
I'm
way.
not
But
offended.
if peace is the light side of it, where do I find in my life the lack of peace? How do if I if I'm at peace, I treat others with peace, but are there ways that I'm violent with myself? That would be a way to look at the shadow side of that value that you have of peace.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I feel like this is all hitting real deep for me today. I was not expecting that, but it's just beautiful. It is. It really
Can
is.
we keep going down this for just a moment? Like, are you both okay
Yeah.
with this? Because I think this will be so helpful for our listeners. So if Rachel also holds authenticity as a value and then is trying to reconcile, like, but I also really value peace. And I'm scared that my authenticity and my voice and my truth disrupts this peace. How does shadow work, right? Like, I love what you were saying. Like, okay, if I want peace, what's the opposite side of that? But what if you're reconciling two conflicting values?
Well,
Conflicting.
yeah, so we would look at both of them. We would say, okay, so the one value is peace. And I gave you an example. How am I not peaceful with myself? And I don't know, I don't know anything about your life, Rachel. So I'm just, this is just in the abstract. Then I would say, okay, the other value that we're going to look at is authenticity. So where do I find inauthenticity? Do I find that the people that I'm around are inauthentic? And if I find something that is inauthentic, do I call it out? Do I create a problem for that person or that institution or whatever it is so that peace has been disrupted? So what I would say in the light side of it is where do peace and authenticity intersect, and where are there times that there is peace but a lack of authenticity, or authenticity with a lack of peace? Does that make sense?
Yes. And that's what we've been struggling with as we're putting our message out is how do you know, I'll just give an example. There was something that I'm really passionate about, but I felt like I was coming at it a little bit uh, too direct, maybe a little snarky. I want to make sure my ego's in check, right? That I'm not trying to say that I'm right and you're wrong. I want to put good out into the world and love out and actually get people to have conversations. And so I was like, even though authentically, this is like what I'm feeling frustration, anger, snarkiness. How do I deliver that so I don't create tension and conflict, but actually do it in a way that it's presented with love so we can have a conversation and it can ultimately lead maybe to peace or knowledge or understanding at the very least of why people believe one thing and others believe another. Am I making sense?
You're
I don't
making
know.
complete sense. So how do
Okay.
we do that? My answer, and we haven't even touched on this, but my answer is narrative medicine. That's this ancient but newly emerging field of using story as a way to heal the world and heal individuals. So there's a number of ways that we use story in healing. One is, Rachel, you've got a story. Jasa, you have a story. I have a story. And the story, a story that is stuck is one that needs to be healed. So there's the story that I have that is one that leads to like a loop. The loop is this problem that plays out over and over again in my life. The story of something that I've gone through that I have healed becomes a medicine story that I can share with someone else. Then there are stories from external sources that I could bring in. So maybe there's a story of Jesus in the Bible, where what did he do? He didn't pass judgment on people. He was with the thieves and the prostitutes, the people who nowadays somebody might turn their back on. And what did Jesus do? He was with the worst of the worst, and he was there to offer them reconciliation, healing on every level. So that's why I say there are stories that are for me that are stuck. There are stories of me that have healing value that I can share with someone else. And then there are external stories. And you guys as both being Bible readers, you could find stories in the Bible, whereas I often use stories from other cultures because I'm more involved in that. So I'll find stories that are specifically healing stories. And then what happens? My mind, my sense of understanding and my beliefs get reorganized. That's part of the healing process as well. I mean, I just opened up a whole chapter that we could do 5 podcasts on, but you get what I'm saying, I hope.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is
Yeah.
so true.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Faith.
I was just gonna say, I think like the reason why stories I think can be so healing is because it reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles, right? I mean, I think that that's the first thing that people sometimes clam up and like, oh my gosh, like well, you judge yourself, right? You judge yourself for feeling a certain way, or you judge yourself for hesitating. We're so hard on ourselves. But then when you learn that other people have not only experienced this, but they found their way out, it's so healing because you feel like you're seen and then you're given a model of like, okay, like I can do that too. And let me look at how they did it. And, whether or not people believe that Jesus Christ was a savior, he is arguably one of the most significant teachers that ever walked the earth, right? So there's so much value to be gained by the parables and how he treated people and really how he lived his life and the stories he told, right? But I think about you and I think the story that you gave, Bob, at the very beginning, where I mean, Rachel and I were just, and I know our listeners are going to be like jaw on the floor listening to how somebody healed themselves through surrender and faith and belief in going to the place that you don't go, right? And I mean, like, if that isn't almost like a metaphor of shadow work, I don't know what is, right? Like, if you're like going to the place that scares you and then you leave healed and whole, that could be physical, that could be mental, or whatever. I personally, and I know Rachel did just because I know her face and I know her expression, like, we gain so much from that. So it's such a beautiful thing to walk away from as like another yet healing modality. And you are becoming a healer because you are almost like this collector of stories and experiences. And you're this walking book of stories to heal other people, which I think is so cool.
Can I give you one more metaphor before?
Yes, I love it. I love a metaphor.
So this is a dream. I call it a dream vision because, there are normal day dreams that just are sort of processing what went on over the course of your day. But there are these profound dreams that really have a lot to say. So this was a dream vision that I had. And I was towards the end of the cohort that was finishing up in a program that I do called Soul Medicine, the journey from calling to healing practice. And I had this dream vision. And in the dream vision, there were 2 piles of roses, a pile of white roses and a pile of red roses. Now, the white roses were carefully organized to the left of me, and they were set up in this really orderly pattern. But the red roses were just chaotically thrown around, piled on top of each other. And I was told in the dream that the white roses represented healing and order, and that the red roses represented the suffering and the chaos of a patient, and that my work was to take the red roses and reorganize them according to the order that I saw in the white roses. And I think if we use that metaphor, we can say that anything that we talked about today is that process. If it was me talking about how I was healed by the power of these social relations among Native people, that was a reordering of the chaos that I felt in my life. if it was Grandpa Chief overcoming cancer and becoming a healer, it was the disorder being replaced with a divine order, a connection with the visitor who he actually thought of as an angel. If it's the shadow work that we're talking about, it's taking the chaos and the suffering of everyday life and saying, we can bring light to it. We can bring order to this experience. So in all of these ways, healing can be explained through that kind of simple metaphor of the two piles of roses.
I feel so. I was just thinking to myself. So every time Jasa gets like spiritual kind of pink, she gets goosebumps. I get teary. I have gotten teary about 7 times during the course of talking to you. Like, so much of this just moves me so deeply. I feel it. Like, I just feel it so intensely. It's just so beautiful.
I know, Bob, like you are really special. Like I feel really blessed that we were able to have you on Spirit Outspoken. And I know I can confidently speak for both of us. Like, we'd love to have you back. I feel like we're just getting started. And
Yeah, I feel like I could talk to you all day. I just want to like keep picking your brain and like soaking up your wisdom here of all this. I love it.
Well, we'll do it again and we'll pull on a different thread. How's that?
Yeah, I love it. I love it. It was, yeah, I feel like I have to journal after this or something.
There's a couple of things that are coming up for
we
free.
would love that.
Please
Yeah.
do. Please do.
So on August 18th, I'm doing a free webinar called Sacred Tools for Healing. And we'll look at what turns something from a mere object to something that is used in healing. What is that process all about? Then on September 13th and 14th, I'll have a free summit, and it's called the Healer's Path Summit, Sacred Stories of Becoming, where we'll have interviews with famous figures in the world of healing, where we kind of look under the hood or behind the curtain, depending on which metaphor you want to use, to find out, how did they become healers in the first place? And how did those stories relate to the work that they do? So on my email list for that and all kinds of freebies on my website, please go to my website, which is my name, www.bobvetter.com. So B-O-B, Vetter is V-E-T-T-E-R. Bob Vetter.
Bob, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, if you're a listener and you're thinking, I have this calling, I've got this rumbling, or some people come to it because they got sick, whatever it is that leads you to that, and you feel this calling, that's who I work with, is people who want to become a healer and work with others.
That's incredible. And like, you guys who are listening, people on social, this is what Rachel and I are talking about when we say, like, follow your intuition, right? Like, Bob is peace, right? And I think a lot of people who are raised in a more traditional Christian or, Catholic upbringing are sometimes scared to look outside of that. And this is a perfect example where you listen, you read the energy. At least for me, this feels very safe. And this is like part of the reason of why we're trying to bring some of these diverse perspectives to our community, is so people can see for themselves exactly who's out there and who it can help and heal, if that's what you need. Thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you both so much for having me today.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you're ready to take your spirituality to the next level, be sure to check out our website, spiritoutspoken.com. There you can download free educational resources, read our latest blog posts, and join the Spirit Outspoken community. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Spirit Outspoken to stay up to date on news, happenings, shenanigans, and all things Spirit Outspoken.